She was the only woman in the room, and they made sure she felt it. The Command Master Chief, a mountain of a man named O'Malley with a neck as thick as a tree trunk, had just introduced her as Lieutenant Commander Evans, our new battalion surgeon. The introduction was technically correct, but the tone was laced with a dismissiveness that hung in the air like stale coffee. The men in the room, a collection of seasoned Navy SEALs and officers with combat patches and thousand-yard stares, didn't bother to hide their skepticism. They shifted in their seats, their body language a unanimous vote of no confidence. Commander Sarah Evans was petite, with sharp, intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense haircut. She looked less like a battlefield doctor and more like a librarian who'd wandered into the wrong briefing. The topic was pre-deployment training injuries. A litany of rolled ankles, stress fractures, and muscle strains was being presented as unavoidable collateral damage. Sarah listened, her jaw tight. She had read the reports. She had seen the patterns. Finally, when a young lieutenant shrugged and said, "It's just part of the gig, ma'am. You can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs," she'd had enough. She stood up, her voice clear and calm, cutting through the low rumble of male agreement. Enough with the excuses. The room went silent. Every head turned. She had their attention, but it was the wrong kind. It was the attention you give a small, yapping dog that has somehow gotten into the room. "These aren't combat injuries," she continued, walking towards the projected image of a sprained ankle. "These are training injuries, preventable training injuries, and they are taking operators off the line for weeks at a time, costing this command millions in training dollars and, more importantly, degrading unit readiness. We are our own worst enemy." A senior chief, a grizzled veteran named Kowalski, with a scar bisecting his left eyebrow, leaned back in his chair. "With respect, ma'am, you don't know what you're talking about. You've been here 5 minutes. The training is designed to be hard. It's designed to push us to the limit. That's how we find the weak links." "Pushing to the limit is one thing," Sarah shot back, holding his gaze without flinching. "Pushing past the point of biomechanical failure is just stupidity. It's not building character. It's building patient rosters. I have the data right here. A 15% increase in overuse injuries compared to last year. That's not part of the gig. That's a systemic failure." The room stirred with indignation. This woman, this doctor, was calling their sacred training protocols stupid. The most senior man present, Colonel James Hangman Hollister, had remained silent throughout. He was a living legend, a man whose name was whispered with a mix of awe and fear. His face was a road map of weathered skin and hard decisions. He hadn't even looked at her when she started speaking, preferring to study a pen he was rolling between his fingers. Now, he slowly raised his head. His eyes were the color of slate and just as cold. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The quiet command in his tone silenced the room more effectively than any shout. "Lieutenant Commander, yeah, I've been doing this job for 25 years. I've led men into hell and back. I think I have a pretty good handle on what constitutes a systemic failure. You've been in my command for 3 weeks. Perhaps you should spend more time listening and less time telling men with 15 deployments how to do their jobs." It was a verbal evisceration, delivered in public. A lesser person would have crumbled, apologized, and retreated. Sarah Evans was not a lesser person. She simply nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement, not submission. "Understood, Colonel. I'll be sure to focus on listening." She sat down. The briefing continued, but the damage was done. In their eyes, she was now the outsider, the academic, the woman who had dared to challenge the hangman and been properly put in her place. O'Malley shot her a smug, pitying look. Kowalski didn't look at her at all, which was worse. She was already invisible to him. Over the following weeks, Sarah did exactly what she said she would do. She listened. But she didn't just listen to the commanders in their briefings. She went to the gym and watched the workouts. She sat in on the training safety briefs. She visited the medical bay every evening, treating the steady stream of patients herself, asking them quiet, probing questions. How did this happen? Were you tired? Had you eaten? Was the new equipment uncomfortable? The SEALs, for the most part, treated her with polite indifference. She was the doc. They answered her questions with grunts and one-word answers, but she noticed things. She noticed the way they pushed through pain, ignoring the small signals their bodies sent them. She noticed a prevailing culture where admitting to an ache or a niggle was seen as a sign of weakness. She noticed that the new high-tech tactical boots, while great for rough terrain, were causing a spike in Achilles tendonitis on the paved roads they used for their endless conditioning runs. She compiled her data, her observations, and her recommendations. She wrote a concise 2-page memo outlining a few simple, non-negotiable changes: mandatory cool-down stretches, a gradual break-in period for the new boots, and a no-fault reporting system for minor injuries so men would come in before a small problem became a debilitating one. She sent it to Colonel Hollister. A week later, it was returned to her via his aide. There were no comments, no feedback, just his initials, J.H., scrawled in the corner. It was a dismissal. He hadn't even read it. He had simply acknowledged its existence and sent it back. The rejection stung, but it didn't surprise her. The men's scorn she could handle. The colonel's active dismissal was a more formidable wall, but she had been in the Navy for over a decade. She had learned that sometimes the only way to get through a wall was to be patient and wait for it to develop a crack. The crack came 6 weeks later, in the form of a battalion-wide combat fitness assessment. It was a grueling event, designed to simulate the demands of a direct action mission: a long run, a casualty drag, an ammunition can carry, and a series of sprints and agility drills. The entire command was out in force, the air thick with tension and the shouts of instructors. Sarah was stationed at the medical tent, positioned near the finish line. She watched as the men pushed themselves to the absolute brink, their faces masks of agony and determination. It was impressive, she had to admit, but she was also watching their form, their gait, the way they held their bodies. The first sign of trouble was a young petty officer who stumbled across the finish line and immediately grabbed the back of his thigh, his face pale. Sarah and her corpsman rushed over. "Hamstring pull, bad one," she said after a quick assessment. "Get him on a stretcher. Ice and compression." It was a minor injury in the grand scheme of things, but it was the first of many. As the afternoon wore on, the medical tent began to fill. Twisted knees, stress reactions in shins, a possible stress fracture in a foot, all preventable, all a direct result of pushing through fatigue with poor biomechanics. Then, the chaos outside the tent intensified. She heard the urgent shouts, the scrambling of feet. A minute later, 4 men came jogging towards the tent, carrying a 5th between them. It was Kowalski, the grizzled senior chief who had mocked her in the briefing. His face was ashen, his teeth clenched in a rictus of pain. He wasn't walking. He was being carried. They laid him on a gurney. His left lower leg was bent at a sickening, unnatural angle, a compound fracture of the tibia and fibula. The jagged end of the bone had pierced the skin, a stark, shocking white against the red of blood and muscle. The sight was enough to make even the most hardened corpsman blanch. Sarah's training kicked in instantly. Her voice became a calm, focused instrument of command. "Okay, let's move. I need a line, lactated ringers, wide open. Morphine? 10 milligrams IV push. Someone get me a sterile saline flush and the trauma dressing. Now!" As her team worked, she looked at Kowalski. His eyes were wide, not just with pain, but with something she rarely saw in a SEAL: fear. He looked at his leg, then back at her, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Am I done, Doc?" he rasped, his voice stripped of all its earlier bravado. It was the voice of a man confronting the end of his career, his identity. "Tell me straight. Am I done?" Sarah didn't offer him false comfort. "Right now, Senior Chief, your only job is to lie still and let us do ours. We're getting you stable, and then we're getting you to a real hospital. We'll worry about the rest later." She worked with a speed and precision born of years of training. She carefully cleaned the wound, irrigating it to remove the debris and dirt. She gently realigned the leg as best she could, a process that made Kowalski groan through gritted teeth despite the morphine, and applied a sterile dressing. She splinted the leg, immobilizing it from hip to ankle. Within minutes, she had him stabilized and ready for transport. As the ambulance sped away, she stood there, her surgical gloves slick with Kowalski's blood. The tent was quiet. The other injured men had stopped their quiet moaning, watching her with a new expression. It wasn't friendliness. Not yet. But it was respect. They had just witnessed her in her element, and she was as calm and effective under pressure as any of them. Colonel Hollister had arrived at some point during the chaos. He stood just outside the tent, a silent observer. He had watched her take control, issue orders, and handle a catastrophic injury with a steady hand and a clear head. He had seen the fear in Kowalski's eyes, and he had seen the way Sarah had acknowledged it without letting it disrupt her focus. He didn't speak to her. He just watched the ambulance disappear, then turned and walked back to his vehicle. But for the first time, he hadn't looked through her. He had looked at her. Kowalski's injury was the turning point. The culture of invincibility had been breached. For the next few weeks, the medical tent saw a steady but different stream of visitors. Men who would have previously tried to walk it off now came in for minor aches and pains. They asked her about stretching, about nutrition, about their boots. She answered every question patiently, but never saying, "I told you so," even though the words were practically on her tongue. Then the news came from the hospital. Kowalski's surgery had been successful, but his recovery would be long. A year, maybe more. His chances of ever deploying again as a SEAL were slim. The news hit the battalion hard. Kowalski was a fixture, a symbol of their toughness. His fall was a reminder of their own fragility. A week after the surgery, Colonel Hollister's aide appeared at the medical tent. "The colonel wants to see you, ma'am, in his office. Now." Sarah's heart rate ticked up a notch, but she kept her face neutral. She walked across the compound, through the outer office where the aide gave her a sympathetic look that did nothing to calm her nerves, and knocked on the heavy wooden door. "Enter." She stepped inside, and Colonel Hollister was sitting behind his desk, but he wasn't looking at papers. He was staring out the window, his back to her. For a long moment, he didn't speak. The silence was a heavy, living thing in the room. Finally, he turned. In his hand, he held her 2-page memo, the one he had initialed and returned. The paper was wrinkled, as if it had been read and reread many times. "I read this again," he said, his voice devoid of its usual hard edge. It was simply tired. "The night after Kowalski got hurt?" He placed the memo on the desk. "You were right. 2 words, simple, declarative. From a man like Hangman Hollister, they were probably the hardest 2 words he had ever spoken. He didn't apologize. He didn't explain his earlier dismissal. He just stated a fact. She was right. Sarah didn't gloat. She didn't even smile. She just nodded. "Thank you, sir." He gestured to the chair opposite his desk. "Sit down." She sat. He leaned forward, his elbows on the desk, his gaze direct. "Tell me everything. Not in a memo, not in a briefing. Tell me what you see. Tell me what we're doing wrong, and don't spare my feelings." For the next hour, Sarah talked. She laid out her observations, her data, her conclusions. She talked about the culture of toxic masculinity that prevented men from seeking help. She talked about the specific biomechanical flaws in their training regimen. She talked about the new boots, She didn't just criticize, she offered solutions. A revised warm-up and cool-down protocol. A dedicated sports medicine physiotherapist to be embedded with the unit. A mandatory class on injury prevention for all new guys. Hollister listened. And he didn't interrupt. He asked sharp, pointed questions. But they weren't challenges. They were requests for more information. When she was done, he leaned back in his chair. He looked older, the lines on his face seeming deeper in the dim light of the office. "I've sent men into combat," he said quietly. "I've brought some of them home in boxes. I've carried that weight for 25 years. But I never considered that I might be breaking them before they even got there. That the training, my training, the thing I built my whole life around might be the thing that takes them out." He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something other than command in his eyes. It was respect. True, unguarded respect. "You tried to tell me, you tried to warn me, and I dismissed you. I was wrong. I won't make that mistake again." He stood up, a signal the meeting was over. She stood as well. As she reached the door, his voice stopped her. "Evans," she turned, "I'm approving every one of your recommendations, effective immediately. You'll have full authority to implement them. You answer directly to me on this. Anyone gives you trouble, you send them to me." It was more than a victory. It was a complete and total vindication. She had been given the keys to the kingdom. The changes were not met with universal acclaim. There was grumbling, especially from the older guys who saw the new protocols as coddling. But with Hollister's explicit backing, the grumbling remained just that. Sarah was a constant presence, demonstrating the stretches, explaining the why behind every change. She was patient but firm, and slowly, the culture began to shift. A few months later, the battalion was preparing for a high-stakes deployment to a volatile region. The pre-deployment workup had been intense, but the injury rate had plummeted. More men were fit, healthy, and ready to go. The night before they were scheduled to fly out, there was a final informal gathering in the battalion's common room. It was a chance for the men to decompress, to have a few beers, and to mentally prepare for what was to come. Sarah had been invited, a first. She stood on the periphery, a cup of coffee in her hand, watching the easy camaraderie. The room was loud with laughter and boasts. Then the door opened, and the noise level dropped by half. Kowalski walked in, leaning heavily on a cane. He had lost a significant amount of weight, and his face was thinner. But his eyes were the same. He moved slowly, painfully through the room. Men clapped him on the shoulder, offered quiet words of greeting. He made his way directly to Sarah. The room fell silent, all eyes on them. They remembered the briefing. They remembered her words and his scorn. This was going to be the moment of reckoning. Kowalski stopped in front of her. He looked down at her, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he reached down and slowly, deliberately, pulled up the leg of his civilian pants. The room gasped. His lower leg was a horrific roadmap of twisted, puckered scar tissue. The shrapnel scars from the compound fracture were vivid and brutal, a permanent, visible reminder of his fall. He held her gaze for a long, tense moment. Then he spoke, his voice rough with emotion, and loud enough for the entire silent room to hear. "Doc," he said, his eyes glistening, "every time I look at this, I remember what I lost. But I also remember who was there when it happened. You didn't just fix my leg that day. You tried to save my career months before, when you told a room full of arrogant assholes to stop making excuses. We were too stupid to listen." He looked around the room, his gaze sweeping over his fellow SEALs, finally settling back on her. "I came here tonight to say thank you, and to tell you that if even one of these knuckleheads comes home safe, because they listened to you, because their ankles aren't blown out or their backs aren't shot, that's on you. That's your win. And I wanted to be the first to shake your hand and say, you were right." He extended his hand. The room was absolutely silent, and the only sound the distant hum of the air conditioner. Sarah looked at his hand, then back up at his face. She saw no shame in his eyes, only gratitude. She saw the shrapnel scars, the undeniable proof of the high price of their previous ignorance. She reached out and took his hand. Her grip was firm. "Thank you, Senior Chief." For a moment they just stood there, the doctor and the warrior, connected by a shared moment of crisis and a shared commitment to the men in the room. Then someone in the back started to clap. It was a single pair of hands, then another, and another. Within seconds, the room erupted in applause. It wasn't just for Kowalski's brave return. It was for her. Across the room, Colonel Hollister raised his glass in a silent toast, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips. So he had learned a valuable lesson. Strength wasn't just about pushing through pain. Sometimes true strength was about having the courage to stop and listen, especially when the voice speaking was one you were tempted to ignore. And for Sarah Evans, the woman whose words had once been dismissed, the silence of that room, broken only by the sound of her own vindication, was the only acknowledgement she would ever need.